Welcome back to part 2 of lecture number 12. We had been talking about the century of humiliation, as it became known in China, as it was overrun for much of the 19th century by outside forces, and how in the early 20th century, after the Qinghai Revolution, that the Chinese will seek to take matters into their own hands and expel foreigners. Unfortunately, they will not be able to liberate themselves entirely from foreign domination, nor will they bring about true political change for the masses. I want to turn now to another East Asian society. I want to talk about Japan during the 19th century, because Japan is going to undergo a rapid period of modernization. So quickly will the country begin to change in so many significant ways that one Tokyo expatriate during the period said that he felt like that he had been alive for 400 years, witnessing so many different significant changes. So what is Japan changing from? Well, Japan under the late Tokugawa shogunate was still a deeply divided society, at least along political lines. For instance, we'll see that some of the domain governments began to modernize and generate some economic growth in places like Satsuma and Choshu, while at the same time the imperial government remained almost frozen in time. The shogunate, a class of warriors, had still maintained a tremendous amount of authority in this society. Meanwhile, from the standpoint of the government in Edo, staffed by cautious bureaucrats, they weren't really inclined to change things much in Japan during this period. One young official described the government during that period as being led by quote unquote wooden monkeys, because these men seemed deaf to calls for progress and change in Japan. And indeed, it won't be an internally motivated change that will lead Japan finally to pick up on its pace of modernization. It's going to be outside pressure applied to the country that will force the imperial government in Japan to finally wake up. This outside pressure will be applied from, of all things, the American naval fleet, led by Commodore Matthew Perry. In 1853, he will lead a fleet of U.S. warships into Tokyo Bay. And the best way to say this is political posturing on the part of the United States. The two countries are not at war. They don't even really trade with one another during this period. But what the United States is doing here is sending a clear signal that they could, if they wanted to, take over Japan, because this fleet of ironclad warships was like nothing the Japanese had seen up until this point. If you can recall from one of our prior lectures, I discussed the notion of sakoku, or the closed door policy that Japan's imperial government decided to settle upon early during the Tokugawa shogunate. The notion that they would sort of try to seal themselves off from the rest of the world. They would only allow a small amount of trade with foreign powers. They wouldn't allow any foreigners into their country unless closely supervised. And what this is going to do is ultimately create kind of a time lag for the Japanese. When you talk about them being able to modernize militarily, they simply haven't been able to do that under this process known as sakoku. They've missed out on a lot of modernization when it comes to medical care or when it comes to economic development. And so this was a rude awakening, what I call the sort of oh crap moment that the imperial government will have when they are kind of slapped in the face with the evidence that they have dramatically fallen behind, especially militarily, many powers such as the United States or France or Britain. And indeed, Japan will experience its own humiliation as a result of this particular interlude the following year in 1854 through the Treaty of Kanagawa. Basically, Japan had to admit U.S. ships to its ports now of Shimoto and Hakodate, and they had to accept a U.S. consul. Very quickly thereafter, other foreign powers will begin landing in Japan and demanding access to Japanese ports and an opening of trade between their countries. This treaty basically ends the notion of sakoku through force and fear. So fear can be a great motivator, and certainly that was what really underlies the so-called Meiji Restoration in Japan. Fear of being overrun, like their neighbor China, by foreign powers led a newer generation of Japanese leaders to be more willing to open up to learning from the rest of the world. The Meiji Restoration will lead to the rapid modernization of Japan's military, its educational system, its economy. Many of the country's leaders began learning about the Industrial Revolution and the imperialist adventures that were bringing countries from China to the Philippines under European sway. In fact, a new generation of Japanese leadership began to wonder, well, if we modernize quickly, if we can build up our forces, maybe we can join these colonizing forces and take over territory outside of Japan. The Emperor Meiji was young, only 17 years old, when he came to the imperial throne in 1868, but he will not be the one calling all the shots. Instead, it will be a younger group of administrators who will decide to move the imperial capital from Kyoto to Tokyo. And they will begin trying to close the gap, the technological gap, the economic gap between Western powers and Japan. The new government, for instance, sent missions to the West to learn about how Westerners practiced banking, how they organized their schools, their political structures. They also were interested in learning much more, obviously, about Western weapons technology. They also dispatched young people to attend Western universities. They brought hundreds of Westerners into Japan for the first time to teach English, to build railroads and buildings, to create an educational system, to edit newspapers, and to teach science. The result was an urban craze for all things Western, everything from men's haircuts to drinking milk. The new government also sought to make Japan a more democratic state. The boundaries between the social classes of Tokugawa Japan were gradually broken down. The samurai class lost its source of livelihood in the land reforms that resulted. Other reforms included the establishment of human rights such as limited religious freedom and limited free speech. Politically, Japan created its constitution in 1889, and a parliament was established while the emperor kept sovereignty. He stood at the top of the army, navy, and executive and legislative power. It was really his cabinet that held the actual power, with a prime minister appointed by the emperor making most decisions of importance. Japan will also put a high priority on modernizing its military. Universal conscription, or a draft, was introduced, and a new army was modeled after the Prussian force, and the navy was modeled after the British Navy. And we will see Japan, as it begins to modernize its military as well as its tactics, coming into conflicts of interest with several of its neighbors. For instance, in the Sino-Japanese War, Japan will defeat China in trying to establish control over Taiwan and portions of the Korean Peninsula. We will also see that Japan will come into direct confrontation with Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. Here again, the Japanese army won the war, gaining territory and, to their mind, gaining some international respect. Japan went on to further increase its influence on the Korean Peninsula and annexed the peninsula completely in 1910. To the Japanese people, these military successes led to increased nationalism and a sense that they too had finally arrived on the world stage and deserved respect. We will also see dramatic changes to the economic and social landscape of Japan as a result of this intensive period of modernization. And some people were not benefiting from these economic changes. For instance, the cost of modernizing and expanding the government and the military was placed overwhelmingly on taxes for landholders, which meant that Japanese farmers often had to bear the brunt of these higher taxes. Another group hurt by modernizing policies were Japan's factory workers, particularly the tens of thousands of girls and women who were forced by poverty into working in the expanding silk and cotton factories. While these women's willingness to work under inhuman conditions for a pittance of pay helped Japan compete on the world market, it also produced surprising amounts of resistance, with workers engaging in work stoppages, even striking for better pay and safer working conditions. These were also the years that gave Japan its first major newspapers, department stores, publicly treated water systems, Modern society was kind of coming into its own under the Meiji Restoration. But an important note must be made. Japan's newfound success in defeating China and Russia gave some political and military leaders a taste for more. It whetted their appetite to expand Japan's influence and to conquer more territory, to prove itself a world power that should be respected and feared. So keep this in mind as we move forward when we talk about Japanese imperialism in the 1920s and 1930s.